Hello, everybody. I'm Bob Jones, originally from CMOS, but now a member of CACOR, and I'm proud to introduce our speaker today uh, on the topic Searching for a Pathway to Hope. Before we do that, I mentioned it's our 281st in the series of weekly lectures from weekly talks from CACOR. And just mention, as usual, the questions and answers. We'll be looking for them in the chat area. And put a C in front of it if you're commenting. And if you're doing a question, a Q will help. And we'll try and get everybody covered. And there'll be an on-deck situation as usual. We'll tell who's coming up. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. And I guess first thing we should know about Mike is how to pronounce his name. He is a little tough. He taught me Brklacich. Professor Mike Brklacich from Carleton University is going to be our speaker. He's got a PhD from Waterloo in geography, a master's from the University of Guelph, and in geography and their Center for Resource Development, and his BSc started off at Trent University, also in geography. Mike has had a 28-year career at Carleton University, and he was chair of the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies from '06 to 12, and associate dean of graduate programs from 2015 to 21, and a chancellor's professor 2014 to 2019. He formally retired from Carleton only in January 22, that's 2022, and he's currently a professor emeritus over there at Carleton. So he has had 40 plus years of interesting interdisciplinary research spanning food security, food systems, rural livelihoods, human dimensions of global environmental change, and environmental policy. And he was supported by multiple Canadian and international funding agencies. Those were the good old days. Mike contributed also to the IPCC for more than 15 years in helping them write their various reports, and he was on the group that was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And just a couple of little additional things, and then we'll get right on to Mike. Mike and I, unbeknownst to either of us, we were neighbors in the area of Briar Green, a subdivision in the west side of Ottawa, and I could throw a stone from my swimming pool over into his yard had I known he was there. But we met through CMOS, and we now drive together occasionally, and we were very glad he found CMOS. And through CMOS, as soon as I saw his talk, a shortened version of this one given to CMOS last year, I said, that's right in CACOR's wheelhouse. So we'll look forward to Mike's talk. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Mike Brklacich.
Thanks very much, Bob. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for that introduction, Bob. And actually, I think CMOS found me. I don't think I found CMOS. And it's been a pleasure to be part of that group for some time now. Look, it's a pleasure to be here today. A few names I know, certainly people like Ted Manning. Ted, I cannot remember the last time I saw you. It's been quite a while, but Ted and I had the pleasure to work together a few times over the years. Look, before we get started, I just want to do a bit of a look back. And for some reason, my screen, I had to admit somebody for some reason. Okay.
So, Mike, if that happens again, just ignore it. We'll do it at our end, okay?
Yeah. For some reason, though, I've shared my screen, but I can't move my slides.
You can't move your slides. Can you click on the slide? Just click on it and then try the up and down arrow.
Okay, there we go. So I want to circle back a bit here and just by way of introduction, let you know that that Club of Rome has had a profound impact on my life. The Limits to Growth book from 1972. I can't imagine anyone in this group has not seen it. Some have probably read it. I actually found my copy from 1972 that I bought at Trent, and you can see I paid a whopping $1.50 for it. Perhaps the best $1.50 I ever invented. And the reason I want to bring this up is, for me, it was a game changer. Prior to that, issues to do with environment, environmental degradation, environmental pollution were effectively uh, local concerns. And this book was, I think, the first one for me that said, hey, we've got to think about this very differently. That we now have evidence that humans are, in fact, altering this planet. We're altering fundamental Earth system processes. And it really sent me in a different trajectory. And I just underlined one little bit here that one of the reviewers had put on the cover, what we can do about it before time runs out. And that, to me is, the key is that, this is not a dealt hand. We have many things that we can do, need to do, should do. And some 50 some years later, that conversation continues. A much less impacting event in my life was I had the opportunity to meet with this group over a lunch meeting somewhere in downtown Ottawa. I can't remember when I was in the midst of working on food security issues. And I look back on that, and the outline for that session is somewhat similar to what we'll actually accomplish today or try to accomplish today. So with that in mind, I want to now turn to, just getting us warmed up with, I'm sure all of us have seen these sorts of headlines. If you're like me, you still get a morning paper. And as you look at it, these things, come up almost daily, unfortunately. And out of the thousands and thousands of gloomy headlines I could have I chose these three because they tend to cover a wide range of topics about gloom. The first one in the top left from the WMO, it's about human activity interfering with the atmosphere. So it's us leading to some sort of environmental change. Here's one that's not, it's only not even 6 months old yet, letting us know that we're still adding to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The one on the right, it's not about the atmosphere, it's about an Earth system process, our weather system. And, this one is showing these, integral impacts, intimate impacts between our activities and what we're doing to this planet, in this case, leading to extreme periods of drought, the heat with no end. And the last one in the bottom corner was from this past week. And you can see I chose one. I don't want to get too wrapped up in what's happening south of the border, but we obviously can't ignore it. But here, the landmark legislation from the Obama era that actually confirmed human activities with respect to greenhouse gas, loading of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, were endangering human health, has been revoked. And so we're on this very shaky ground yet once again. So that gives you a sense, I hope, of the range of things when we're speaking about gloom, and we are bombarded with those almost on a daily basis. On a somewhat brighter note, and the topic of this meeting, though, is about these glimmers of hope. And let's spend our time mainly on this. Here's again just 4 headlines that I think help us find our way through these areas of hope. On the left is EV sales in the last 25 years. And if we look at all the countries where EV sales are 50% or higher, I believe there's 8 of them there, and 7 of them are in Europe, which to me sends a very strong signal that change is possible and needs to happen. But as we know with anything to do with electric vehicles, the source of that electricity is critically important. If in fact we're just plugging our cars in at night and they're being charged by electricity that's been generated by a fossil fuel, really all we're doing is displacing where the fuel or where the greenhouse gas is being emitted. But there is, I think, some evidence now, certainly, that we're moving away from that. Here's something from last October confirming that renewables are now outperforming coal in terms of source of electricity across the world. Another important point one that's been around for a long time, but I always needs reinforcing. And it was good to see this earlier this year in the Globe. Is we don't have to speak about environment and economy as trade-offs. Clearly, there's much more there than just being a trade-off, that we can put these things together, and we need to put them together and not think of them as foes. And for me, one of the most stunning and provocative statements or that we've heard in the last 12 months or so was AAAS's flagship journal Science put unstoppable growth of renewable energy as the breakthrough event for 2025. So all of this to me suggests we're heading there is hope out there. It's not all doom and gloom. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do today is spend about 10 minutes on reviewing the gloom. I think this crowd is very much well aware of where the sources of gloom, but I just want to put it out there as reminders from both science and policy perspectives. And then let's take a look at a number of pathways that we might pursue in terms of turning this around. And so back to the very first or the second slide from the limits of growth cover, what we can do before we run out of time is still, I would say, top of our agenda. Having said that, look, I'll warn you now, this seminar is completely guilty of being a kilometer wide and a centimeter deep. And many of the topics I'll talk about today, they could in fact be a seminar in their own right. But I want to try to cover lots of territory. So we do have to put some boundaries on this. And two important ones are, could we, in fact, let's say net zero is our our ultimate goal. If that's the case, can we get there through a number of minor shifts that collectively mean something, or are we talking about a substantial radical shift in the way we go about our day-to-day lives? I'm not going to address that today. It's a critically important question, but I think just too much to cover in one day. And similarly, the whole area of tipping points, this has received considerable attention in the last 25 years, where at some point we will hit a point of no return in an Earth system process. And again, let's put that to one side for today. I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying it's beyond what we can actually speak to directly. We can certainly talk about these items in the Q&A period if necessary. So let's quickly move on to the gloom side of things. So they're each start with a G. So gloom point number one. I think everyone knows this starting point. I'm not going to speak anything to it in any huge way or any detailed way. There is an energy budget for the planet. The few key points I'd like people to take away from these two slides, these two graphs. One is greenhouse gases occur naturally in our environment, in our atmosphere. If they didn't, we'd be a frozen rock going around the sun. The other is that we've had lots of variability in both carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases as well, and the Earth's temperature over the last 800,000 years. Well, there's been lots of variability. It's also important to recognize that there's been both upper limits and floors to this. So there seems to be some sort of planetary guardrails. Gloom number two is the only chart that I use that actually terrifies me. And this looks at the last 800,000 years. So here's what we saw in the previous slide. And we were working nicely, or the planet was working nicely within these defined guardrails. And since 1950, roughly the time when I was born, and I'm not going to take sole responsibility for this, but it's our lifetime is the key point, is we've now, gone way past that upper level. And it's, I think, very interesting that in the previous 800,000 years, the amplitude from the floor down here up to this top line was about 130 130 parts per million of CO2. We're now 124 above that. So we not only have we broken through that ceiling, the manner in which we've broken through is anything beyond imagination over the last 800,000 years. The next gloom item I want to just quickly talk to is it's not just the temperature of the Earth It's multiple signs. I'm not going to go through any of these in any detail. The point I want to make here is um, if you go in and see your GP for your annual checkup, and if you're like me, that's about every 5 years, you if you've put on a few pounds, your GP might say something to you like, hey, you're sort of heading the wrong direction, try to change it. If you go in a year later and you've put on a few more pounds and now your blood pressure's up a bit, then you might get a bit more of a stern warning. And if 3 or 4 years later you go in and you're heavier and your blood pressure's up even more, and perhaps kidney function is starting to deteriorate, you'll get a sterner warning, and perhaps some statements like, it's not a question of if you're going to have a catastrophic health event, it's when. And that's what I fear the most when I see these sorts of graphs. We're talking about system-wide functions here being adversely impacted. I'd be remiss not to note that there has been some, I think, very valiant and noble attempts to try to change our collective behaviors. To everyone in this group who is familiar with is Kyoto in '93 and Paris in 2015. And I think it's safe to say that they haven't taken us to the place we want to go. Yes, they may have slowed things down a bit, but I think it's fair to say that at this level, international protocols have largely been ineffective, and perhaps we might even say they've failed. Another point of gloom that's really important is if we again assume net zero is where we want to head, it's going to be a very uneven transition. This is not something that's going to happen on a nice, smooth, incremental timeline. There's going to be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back on a regular basis. Here's again an example from the South where a president continues to use language like con, scam, and hoax when they're speaking about climate. And there's this, I think, something that is quite different in the last 10 years, say, is the use of misinformation when it comes to climate catastrophes. And this is, I think, something that is changing the dimensions of the way in which we think about and frame climate change. The 6th item I just want to talk about in terms of gloom is, even if we could change our behavior and get to net zero emissions, greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, it's going to be a rocky road for many decades. There's so much inertia in the system. And this graph is looking at insured losses over the last 35 years or so. And because we are locked in for such a long time, or for a substantial period, we're looking at decades of very difficult times, even if we can, in fact, turn this policy around. And the final point I want to make, or the final area of gloom I just want to touch on, is about policy complexity and disasters. Now, policy complexity isn't a new issue. I mean, this was something I heard about, we studied when I was at Trent in the first half of the 1970s. But this book that came out earlier this year by a journalist, Jacob Soboroff, was his experience with the Los Angeles wildfires a year ago now. And I think this book helped for me really frame these area of complexity and how policies interact and how this can really affect us in some unforeseen and profoundly negative ways. I'm not going to go through the list on the right-hand side about the perfect storm. I'm just going to cover a few items. The first couple are really environmental. But then, in terms of fighting this one, part of the response was tempered by inadequate water supply, inadequate pressure, and inadequate fire trucks, leading to all sorts of accounts of first responder fatigue. Politicization and misinformation of disasters was rampant. New scum was the president's way of referring to the governor for California, and there supposedly was some fictional tap somewhere that had been turned off. And if we only turn this on, we'd be able to bring more water to the LA area to help fight these fires. And the last few here, this surge to a transition to electric vehicles, the accounts of EV batteries exploding in LA at that time were unprecedented. And I think, again, this is something we've not thought through. Changes in policy, well, the ones to environmental institutions such as NOAA and FEMA, I think, are fairly obvious. Purging of occupational health at a federal level led to it was part of the reason why we had so much first responder fatigue. These folks are essential in trying to keep people, protect mental health, and yet here we were pulling the rug out from under them. The last two, I think, were pretty interesting as well. Immigration policy, already there was efforts to remove so-called illegal immigrants from California. And one of the concerns there is, and I'm not recommending that this supports the notion of illegal immigration, but who's on the front line when it comes time to clean up after a disaster? And so in many ways, our immigration policies were robbing us of important labor during the recovery phase. And land sales became very distorted. Individuals were finding it very difficult to get insurance on properties. And of course, there was some companies around that were keen to buy up properties at very low prices and looking to long-term change in the land market in Southern California. So, to me, this was Soberoff's capturing of this, to me, focused my attention a bit more on policy complexity and adverse impacts than I might have before. If you don't wish to read the book, you might want to have a listen to the CBC Sunday magazine from January the 11th, where Soberoff was interviewed. Very compelling arguments put forward. So look, I'm just going to wrap up this introduction with a few points. Hopefully it's not too gloomy yet, but just focus on the bottom right one, Paul Crutzen, who I only had the pleasure of meeting a couple of times. Paul was the one who I believe did coin the term Anthropocene, and he was making the point back in the early 2000s that our activities as humans, we were in fact becoming an Earth system process. We were altering the biological, chemical, and geological process. And this is not a question that we might be doing this, we were doing it. And so I think, those are fundamental things. We cannot hide them. At the same time, I think it's important that we not be paralyzed. And so here's an example from almost a year and a half ago now from the New Scientist. This is not the time to sit on our hands. It's not the time to become paralyzed by all this gloom. We need to, in fact, double down and work even more aggressively on how can we transition from gloom to hope. So it's in that light that I will offer this uncritical review of can we pull back from the brink. By uncritical, I'm meaning I'm going to put out a number of ideas. I'm not going to try to rank them in any way, either by which might be preferable from a policy point of view, which might be preferable from a financial point of view, which might be preferable from what could we do today versus what we might do in 10 years' time, and so on. So please look at today as more of an inventory rather than a blueprint of how we might transform our social and economic systems. As a geographer, I always have to try to organize things, and I came up with this partial catalog of looking for hope. I believe there's a dozen or so things in here. Today, I'm going to try to cover off 7 or 8 of these. We'll see where we are with times. So the ones that have a little tick beside them are the ones that I'll spend some time on today. The other ones in my slide kit, there is some information on those. I'm going to just put those to one side today owing to time. So let's start off with a hope theme of growing greenhouse gas reduction potential. And there's been a number of important things that have occurred over the last 20 some years. One is the costs of renewable energy have been going down and down and down. And that's fairly typical. Any new energy or any new technology is always very expensive early on. And as we get more proficient at producing it and it becomes more mainstream, then we start to see unit costs going down. So hopefully renewable energy is becoming it's dropping in price to the point where it is now more widely available to a bigger segment of society. In addition, the benefits of reductions from current technology are very long lasting. And so the diagram on the left here is looking at clean energy exports from China from 2024. Now, over the lifetime of those particular installations, we're looking at 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide that won't be put into the atmosphere. And that's with adopting of new technology. So I think this is very important points in terms of being optimistic, that we look for these opportunities that are there. This is not science fiction. These are not things that need to be done in 10 that are something we can tackle in 10 or 15 years. These are things that are within our grasp at this time. The final one I want to speak to is, in fact, I'm hopeful. I'm not going to say I'm fully convinced that we've turned the corner and perhaps we're not at potential anymore. Perhaps we are speaking in a stronger voice about actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And these two slides get to that, or start to speak to that, especially the one in the bottom, which looks at CO2 emissions from China. And they've been flat or falling for almost 2 years. So hopefully this is not a short-term trend. This is one where we can start to see this move. And Hannah Ritchie, a data scientist, the long-awaited decline in fossil fuels is within sight. Hopefully that is something that is accurate now. So, so our first area of hope is we have a lot of technology today that, in fact, is very helpful and that we can deploy. I want to move on now to another one, and that's carbon capture. And I want to put this in for a few reasons. One, it's been getting an awful lot of attention in the last 12 months, and especially here at home in Canada. I think it still remains extremely controversial. And I'm hoping that we can at least explore this with an open mind and hopefully be in a position to better position carbon capture within the toolbox of things we might use to address climate change. I just want to start off by saying, let's make sure we distinguish between two basic forms of carbon capture. One is carbon capture and sequestration, and that's where you, in fact, do the capturing right at the source. So we don't allow the CO2 to actually get into the atmosphere or the carbon to get into the atmosphere. The other is through various technologies to actually remove carbon dioxide from the air itself. And today, I want to focus on carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. So let's put carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere to one side for the remainder of today. Look, it's a fairly new technology. The points I want to make here is in the top left is we're looking at trying to remove emissions from large-scale facilities. So, think of major petroleum sites. This is what we're looking at. And again, it's about trying to avoid having carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere. And their promise here is substantial. Looking at going from 43 million tons of carbon dioxide up to 279. So we're looking at what is that? It's a six-fold, seven-fold increase over a period of less than 10 years. So, as there is with any new technologies, there's certainly room for growth. I think it's beyond aspirational. At the same time, I think there is some overhyping of what is possible. And so I think we need to be mindful in terms of trying to position carbon capture and storage within our toolbox. that we're not talking about proven technologies at this point, as we were with some of the other technologies about reducing greenhouse gases, but there is promise. One of the ones that has gained a lot of attention in our country in the last 12 months, 24 months, is the Pathways Alliance foundational projects. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just want to emphasize 3 points. One is it's massive from 3 different views. One is the area. I mean, we're talking about 20 different mining sites. It's covering a huge territory. It's also extremely large in terms of CO2 production emission reduction in those emissions. You can see trying to make our way to net zero over a period of about 25 years in capturing, storing that carbon. And the final point is it is costly. We're talking about, projects that are in the billions and billions of dollars. And, this is where this area is. It's still exploratory. And I'll return to that in the next set of slides when we're talking about Canada in a bit more depth. Where I want to wrap up with the carbon capture is, I think there's the World Resources Institute put out a report a couple of years ago now, last year, and I think it did a very good job of positioning carbon capture. One is it's critical in terms of our attempts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it also is limited. So to me, the message that's coming out loud and clear is let's not bank all of our hopes on this one. Okay, there is a place for it, but it's a complementary tool. And there will be places where eliminating fossil fuel use is not feasible. And it's in those contexts where carbon capture is perhaps the most appealing. So let's move cautiously as we move forward with the whole area of carbon capture and storage. I think it would be inappropriate to remove it from our list of opportunities of hope. But at the same time, I think to put too much effort on this would certainly, I think, be irresponsible. What I'd like to do then is now move on to Canada. And lots has been happening here in the last 10 years. And I want to start with where we were in 2024. This page it's a screenshot from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Again, I'm not going to go through any details here, but I think our last administration should be commended about putting together an extremely thorough, wide-ranging approach to addressing climate change that included both mitigation and adaptation, in basically all aspects of energy production and consumption. So I think in terms of comprehensiveness, they get it's a very credible plan. And let's not forget that in terms of our institutional memory. If we unpack that, I'm sure this is a diagram that most of you have seen. And the contributions of various approaches to addressing climate change varies a lot. Over on this side, we have large emitters, oil and gas caps, methane regulations. You can see we're looking at the bulk of in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is where we need to, in fact, be true to our word to really increase activities. The fuel surcharge, the so-called carbon tax, was somewhere in the 10% range. Clean fuel regulations were helping. Investment in tax credits, not so much. And you can see that our desire to switch to electric vehicles is really not that much of a bonus. It contributes, but it's not. We're looking at, if you will, very marginal increases or improvements when we're looking at everything here from waste methane capture through to environmental or to electric vehicles, whereas much of the interest or much of the opportunity to reduce emissions is over at the production end. As we know, this particular set of regulations let's just say was not well received. And here's, I think, four of the reasons why that it was not well received. I'm sure there's others. One was the buy-in from provinces and the private sector was, I'd be generous if I said variable, in many cases very limited, sometimes even hostile. And I think it just showed that there was, the groundwork was not done in advance. Um, my guess is if you're in a communications department, what happened over this period of time would be held up as how not to go about it, especially with the fuel surtax. It was certainly mismanaged. The other was, I think, about regulation reliance. Certainly, there seems to be a certain segment of society that is very much anti-regulation, regardless of what the regulation is. And the other part was there was a number of obvious disconnects between climate change plans and other areas, especially to do with pipelines and so on. So it's in that context, I think, that it's safe to say that there was a need for a change. And here are, I think, three different views that really indicate or what shaped the change that we're now undergoing in Canada under the current Liberal government. The first one is, despite all these efforts, we've been missing every target we've ever set for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's pretty hard, I'd say, to justify, let's take it on the chin for a while because there's long-term benefits, because clearly that wasn't the case. The other was the current government is very much in favor of a more flexible, practical approach rather than these heavy-handed regulations. And the final point is about looking at investment in economy, in industry as a way to drive clean growth rather than trying to regulate it. So there's been, I think, a very large shift in where we're starting from and what the cornerstones are for these new policies. I've tried to put together a comparison of where we were at the end of the Trudeau government and where we are at the early days of the Carney government. And I'm finding it increasingly difficult. There's no one place to go. So, look, this is my attempt to pull this together. And I emphasize it's partial. And apologies if I haven't got it all right. I suspect there's people in the audience that are much better and more knowledgeable about this than I am, but I'll give it a shot. So the first is the consumer carbon tax. Well, that was, where you paid at the pump and you got your check or something deposited into your bank account. Was it 3 times, 4 times a year? That's been repealed. But again, remember, that was, we're looking at something like 5 or 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. Under EV sales, we had the electric vehicle availability standard, and that was about increasing the availability or increasing EV sales incrementally every year and by 2035 being at 100%. And there was also at one point subsidies to buy those vehicles. That's been replaced by the electric vehicle affordability program that was announced last week. Subsidies have been brought back, but they're much leaner and they're diminished. There is a planned phase out. I believe there's more money in there for charging stations. And look at the huge growth in terms of auto market diversification. And that includes many things, but also about expanding the EV market penetration. So quite a difference. And again, in an area that was not, from the point of greenhouse gas emission reductions, a relatively small part of the pie, but nevertheless an important part. In terms of the industrial carbon tax, there was a hard cap, net zero by 2050. We've seen, I think, some strengthening in carbon pricing here in the last 6 months. And certainly securing investments for clean energy has been very much on it. Carbon capture and storage, I think, is the one where there's been the biggest change. We are looking at potentially 25 projects up and running by 2030. Carbon capture and storage is now eligible under the investment tax credit, and there's talk about constructing the world's largest carbon capture and storage facility in this period of time. So in an area that's not proven, where there's lots of hope and most likely has limited capacity, we're looking at at much larger investments. So I think there's some questions to be asked there, but I think I'm going to leave that on the hope side of things. So that's it for the Canada and the national views. There's other cases we could bring in. I'm going to leave those out for today. What I want to do now is turn to the other end of the spectrum and look at local climate change actions. And I just want to emphasize there's two ways to look at local, or at least two. One is local as a municipality, the city of Ottawa. The other is citizens groups and where they might take us. And so I just want to distinguish between those two because I think they have different roles to play, but both fall under the local banner. Here's the City of Ottawa's plan, very briefly. It's fairly typical, and they're making formal commitments to prepare for extreme weather events. They're also trying to reduce our emissions and trying to build resilience. So this sort of spectrum of activities is fairly common. If you look at most major cities across Canada, you'll find similar areas. And again, I think incredibly important areas of hope of what's happening locally. And perhaps this is a statement, is this where our focus should be, as opposed, or should we be putting more of a focus at local rather than national and international scales? It's not just large cities. Here's something from Lanark County for those of us in the Ottawa area just outside of town. And these are very much about what can I do as a person, as a citizen? And so I think that's really important that we remember this, that there's really important ways that we can address climate change, not just from national and international standards, but also what can we do as individuals? And there's many of these different organizations. Here's one in Lanark County, much smaller, much less formal approach than what we see in Ottawa. Another one, just as an example of a citizens group, Seniors for Climate Action Now, SCAN, is a fairly well-established group. And, one of the things I find interesting about this group is if you look at what they are advocating, I mean, they're talking about wholesale change, move from growth to sustainability, move from accumulation to sharing, etc. I mean, this is a wholesale change in the way in which we would actually address things. So in my sense is of this particular group, it's not just folks getting together for coffee on Tuesday morning. These are folks that are looking at quite a bit of change in society and advocating for that change. Another example I just use is something called Climate Fresk. It's an international organization, and it's really about demystifying climate science and bringing it to individuals so they can, in fact, get a better appreciation of it, but also so that they can, in fact, lead to, that they can, in fact, take action and not feel powerless in the face of this juggernaut called climate change. And their starting point is usually IPCC. They've distilled it into about 60 cards that cover off human interference with the atmosphere, climate change, and possible results. And so they have facilitators, they train these facilitators, and it is very much a on-the-ground set of activities. In Ottawa, a colleague, Dawn Spruill, has been instrumental in heading this up. And in the first 2 years of operation, Dawn was able to run 53 workshops, reached over 300 people. And you can see some of these were general public, but they was in the schools and also in work environments. So if you're interested in this particular one, you can either get a hold of Dawn directly or find more information at the Climate Fresk website. I'm not advocating that everyone join Climate Fresk. I'm just making the point that when we look at places of hope, what is happening in our backyard at the local area, I think, is to a large extent underutilized. And it's an area where I think we can make some important changes. Another point I just want to cover in terms of hope is I think it's now this whole area of moving beyond climate science is pretty important. It's been growing in the last 15 years or so. I only have one slide on climate justice. We could have a whole seminar on it. And I'm not suggesting that the Catholic Church is any better than any other organization. It's just one where I think there has been a fairly sustained effort, starting first of all with with Francis, and now to Pope Leo, where in fact it's very much about at the heart of what they're doing is about humanity and human well-being. It's not about the environment, but it certainly recognizes those. And I think it's a very different take. Another, I think, important area beyond climate science is the area of how do we actually represent it? And if we were actually meeting in a particular room, if I asked how many people have used this chart to explain climate change, this is changes in global surface temperature over a period of time under various scenarios. And I know I'd put my hand up. And if there's a way you want to ensure that you have really poor community relations, it's to start with this chart. It works very well amongst the science community. It's not a particularly helpful tool in terms of engaging communities. Here's two examples where I think it can be more productive. One is a couple of years ago now, here in Ottawa. It was someone sponsored this program of children to draw and paint how kids are seeing our changing planet. And it's certainly not the way IPCC sees it. And I think it's important that we recognize and differentiate when we're thinking about our communications, about to whom are we communicating. And it's also here an example of a major art installation in Santa Barbara. So these opportunities are there. As an aside, a number of years ago, a PhD student I was working with on work on climate change and communities, we actually moved away completely from the sort of chart that we see in the science community, and we had someone do murals on potential climate change that related to the community. In fact, in terms of opening those conversations, very effective. One of the ones I just want to talk about briefly now is loss and damage. This to me is a new area, and I'm going to say might be gaining traction in terms at the international level. And basically the starting point for loss and damage, it's been promoted by the lower income countries now for probably 15, 20 years, is mitigation and adaptation have to be at the start. It's what we need to do, but sometimes there will be loss and damage. And when we can't, in fact, address everything through mitigation and adaptation, we need to, in fact, look at loss and damage. And there's some examples at the bottom of this slide about what loss and damage might mean. And this was talked about for quite a while. And one of the things that was, I think, quite interesting was at COP26 in 2021, it got onto the agenda, but that was about it. The whole area of liability that might rest with the developed countries was so daunting that they blocked any movements to go beyond discussion. And I think, that was understandable. I'd say even predictable. But one of the things that was quite interesting was in Egypt at the COP27, things changed where they actually created a loss and damage fund. And I must admit, I was shocked that this happened, that it moved that quickly. And so to me, that was a very strong signal that loss and damage was becoming more and more important, that this fund was created. Historical responsibility was on the agenda. So it's, what we see down here in the bottom right. It wasn't just what you were putting out now. It was about emissions that you'd put out over since the Industrial Revolution. And even though there were times there where people were emitting greenhouse or uh, industries were emitting greenhouse gases without knowing they were, you were still responsible for those. So this whole notion of historical responsibility came in, and this also put liability on the agenda, which I was stunned that this actually not got on the agenda, but there was actually some recognition of it, and a fund was created. But I think we have to acknowledge that in this fund, they need down here in this area is about $435 billion per year for loss and damage. The pledges are about $300 million a year. So we're talking multiple orders of magnitude difference between what is needed for loss and damage and what's actually there. But at least the idea is on the agenda. Oops, sorry about that. When we got to 2024, I would say the important things here were frameworks were in place at COP or were refined at COP 29. The whole area of mitigation and adaptation being first, loss and damage only when needed was there. And again, this whole notion of some progress, but much remains, I think was the key message in 2024. In 2025, I would say treading water was perhaps the best way to describe this. So I'm not sure where this is heading. When one group says the most significant outcome is the completion of the third review of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, boy, when the most significant outcome is completion of a review, that is certainly sending signals to me that we still have an awful lot of work to do. And so loss and damage remains on the agenda. I'm just not sure the interest that was signaled 3-4 years ago is solidified. I don't think it's going to disappear. However, I'm not sure it's going to become a cornerstone either. So let's keep this on the agenda as part of our rays of hope. I just want to turn now to another area, and that is the use of the courts. And there's all sorts of discussions around establishing environmental precedents in courts, but it's with us. And I'm just going to quickly mention 3 here, just again, that I see as potential opportunities of hope. One now is 5 years old. And this was in Quebec, where a group of folks under the age of 35 got together and said the government of Canada was failing to act on, or its failures to act on climate change was violating our constitutional rights. The interesting thing about this one, it was dismissed because it didn't meet the fundamental requirement or base requirements for what is a group. And so under 35-year-olds was not a group, basically. But they didn't rule on climate change inaction and human rights. That was put to one side. 2 years ago now, we saw this landmark decision in Europe where Swiss women were, in fact, it was confirmed that climate change, it ended up in the European Human Rights Court, and that their rights had been violated. So I think we have had significant precedents set at that level, and also in the International Court of Justice. This was the case, and to me, the most important point about it being this ruling last year from the International Court of Justice was it makes it very clear that climate change is not only human rights problems, but the states recognized national entities actually have responsibility. They cannot slough it off as, oh, this is an international problem over which we have no impact. So I think that's very important that we look at it in those contexts. So the courts, I think, are becoming more important in another way in which we can address climate change issues. The last one I wish to speak to is climate change and health. This has been emerging for a number of years now. When it first started, it's been on the agenda for many, many years, for decades. It was really about, vector-borne diseases, etc. And that's what is what we're looking at here. So, who's prone to heat stress and so on. And I'm not suggesting these are unimportant, but the whole area of climate change and health has grown a lot. And mental health has become, I would say, uh, has moved over the last 5 years or so from being a fringe area of research to something that is critical and now seen as something that is critically important. And so there's just expanding on this with three things here. This little cartoon. Whenever I want mom to play Fortress, I just turn on the news about climate change. So this whole area of mental health being a concern. The Canadian Commission looking at has elevated this to understanding and coping. In this picture here, I apologize for the terrible photography. I took the picture. It was on a mailbox in my neighborhood. I have no idea who put it up, but there was this thing. Oh, there was these signs stuck on the side where you could get a number. Are you feeling overwhelmed by the climate crisis? I don't know who the group was. I don't know if they had any authority, if they were reputable, but it's at that level that we have seen the whole area of climate change and mental health occur. I just want to quickly go back to my time as a teenager in the 60s. And I just want to remind people anxiety is not new. I think there's a lot of new things about climate change and health. I'm using one example here. If anyone remembers the song by Barry McGuire, Eve of Destruction, it was all about anxiety. There's part of it, if the button is pushed, there's no running away. There's no one to save. So it was all about individual powerlessness. It was with a failure of government. Handfuls of senators don't pass legislation. And the other part was the crisis is known, but it's being met with inaction and denial, which seems to be happening way too often these days. Uh, and so anxiety is not new, but I think the way in which individuals are bombarded with climate change and the way in which we frame climate change is significantly different than what I experienced as a teenager in the middle 60s. So climate anxiety, there's two ways to look at it. One is the direct experience that we have of extreme events. And, as an example, two members of my family have been evacuated, and I know some other folks, some friends that have been, if not evacuated, but put on evacuation alert. And one of my neighbors, who's from the interior of southern BC, her mom keeps a go bag in the truck during fire season. So I think, this is very different than what we used to have. And the other is about exposure to climate change information is, I think, so different. And I think we should add misinformation there as well. And so we're seeing all sorts of groups now becoming involved in, and I think what it has is it's elevated to climate anxiety and grief are real. This is no longer a fringe topic. It's something that is being addressed in a substantial way. Here's one group or one organization around it by Britt Ray. And then there's 6 points here I just want to spend a moment on each one. Your your vocabulary about climate change. I know I haven't used the expression war on climate change for over a decade. Part of the reason for doing that is I didn't think it was particularly helpful to invite the military into the discussion. So why do we want to set it up for them? But if we always speak of it as, gloom, well, then in fact, I think we're creating an environment for paralysis and for anxiety. The other is anxiety is not inherently bad. I think it's something that's part of our day-to-day life, but we do need to acknowledge it. The other is about care and is self-care. And so earlier I spoke about about local organizations that are looking at climate change, and I think connecting with these are particularly important. And I think that translates into the fourth item about building resilience. And in some cases, evacuation planning is critically important that's there before the disaster happens. And finally, just this whole area of retaining hope. Where is this? This is going to be quite variable for individuals. And I think we need to think about these things about how can you best position yourself? And there is not, if you will, a silver bullet or a set guidebook. we really need to think about this in a bigger way. So I'm going to wrap it up with a couple of things. One of my favorite Bizarro cartoons that speaks to the Anthropocene is very much about gloom is real. Let's not underestimate that. And humans are prompting this through our impacts on the environment. So this is very much speaking to the Anthropocene. I've addressed a handful of different issues today, relied on a bunch of different resources. This catalog of climate hope is growing by the day. So I think we're not lacking ideas. I think how we put them forward is, I think, an important challenge that we're looking at. Also, I want to make the point that as we move forward, I think we have to expect the climate action pathways are going to be chaotic. We're not going to have a nice, smooth pathway. And, it is going to be steps forward and steps back. And the challenges are going to be tough. And it's going to be really hard. And I find solace in one of my favorite Ottawa area singer-songwriters, Bruce Cockburn, from a song that had nothing to do with climate change, Lovers in a Dangerous Time. But nothing worth having comes without some kind of a fight. You got to kick at the darkness till it bleeds daylight. And I think we are at the kicking at the darkness stage. We have, I think, this opportunity to transition from gloom to hope. It's going to take a lot of work. I'll just wrap it up by going back to where we started. Limits to Growth, I think, had it right in terms of what can we do about it before we run out of time. And this quote, I'm not sure that Desmond Tutu was the first person to use it, but it certainly, I think, captures where we are today. He's not, he was saying, I'm not an optimist, or I'm not an optimist, I'm a prisoner of hope. And I believe we have to be these prisoners of hope. Otherwise, we will be overcome by gloom and we will find it very difficult and unable to do things before we run out of time. Thank you. Apologies if I took a bit longer than planned. Back to whoever's moderating.
Yes, that could be me. I'm just turning my video. My video has been disabled. Bob Jones back again. And I think it's going to be enabled by Raymond very quickly. Has he done it yet? I can't. Oh, there you are. We're on. Okay, we have a number of questions in the chat. And we also have the usual first question prerogative, which I'm going to ask. This was such a wide-ranging talk. I think we covered so many areas of interest to CACOR that I don't know really how to ask a question. So I'm just going to ask a very simple one because I was moved by the repetition of from the book 1972, Limits to Growth, the can't do, won't do, must do thing, and that's very strong. And of course, the second thing that was mentioned, that we're missing all the targets. All the countries are missing their targets. And so I guess if I ask any one question to Mike, it might be, does one thing stand out that you can point to that's causing this foot dragging or trying to get something started? All the other stuff follows from that. But is there one thing that's happened? You've studied this so widely, maybe you can have a shot at that.
Geez, thanks for the lob ball. Um, um, is there one thing? I'm not sure there is. I don't understand it, Bob. I think we've done a miraculous job of enhancing awareness, knowledge of climate change. I don't think we have found the recipe yet for bringing various players on board. And I think part of that has been focusing on the international level, which was the norm for much of my career. I think was wonderful in some ways, but I think it was also a disservice because it allowed you to individuals, I think, to pass the buck to somebody else and also to move it down the road. And so I think this making things more tangible, addressing the questions, what can I do? What can my community do? That's where I start to see more hope. So that's my best guess of what's happened. I'm not going to try to understand climate deniers at this time. Hopefully that gets us started.
Got you. We have three questioners, sort of. Peter McKinnon will be up first. He has two questions, and perhaps he can cover them both in the first instance. And on deck will be Richard Vanderjagt. He has the second question, and then there'll be a third one by Paul Beckwith. After that, we're going to go into the commentary, and many comments have been made, and the subjects are interrelated, and the questions are similar. So we'll get to those after we cover the first two. Peter starts, and then Richard is on deck. Peter?
Thank you, Bob. And Michael, thank you for a very broad-ranging discussion. I thought it was really quite interesting. It touched a number of areas of my own interests as well. I just had a couple of simple questions at the beginning here. I was just wondering what you know, or anyone else some people have contributed to this already in the discussion, but what do you know, or what might you comment on about the closing of Mauna Loa and the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the United States as a recent move by the American government to try and hide climate change?
Let me answer it on two levels. One, not shocked. I mean, we have an administration that has zero interest in science or anything to back up what they're doing. They just want to pick things that they want. And so if there is something that might in fact represent opposition to their views, their objective is to shut it down. So I'm not shocked. What I find a bit more disturbing is it makes me rethink something that I thought I understood, and maybe I did understand in the 1990s and the early 2000s. I used to find that, being a faculty member at a university, grad students, one of the worst things about them is they'd graduate and go on. And so the notion of having something that was a continuous monitoring and updating, a long-term cross-section of something, was very difficult to maintain at a university. And to me, that was one of the most important roles that governments could play, the public sector could play, was they were perhaps not as good at innovation, but they were much better at, maintaining long-term horizons. And so I'm concerned that we're seeing threats to those. We've seen it here in Canada too. I don't think to the same level. So I'm not surprised. And as you know, on these sorts of things, once you break the cycle, it's very hard to get them started up, and you lose crucial information. So, I guess the good news is that record is in place. We've got what started in the early 50s, so we've got 75 years. Let's hope that is enough evidence that we can rely on that. I'm assuming it's not coming back anytime soon.
Good, thank you. I had another one that I just put in a little while ago, if I may, Bob, just to ask this, because this is more to the point of this lecture. Climate change, of course, is just one part of a polycrisis of the environment, as I'm sure you well recognize.
Yep.
How do you see us addressing this issue of the polycrisis of the environment when we're having enough difficulty even recognizing globally among leadership of nations that there is a climate change issue before us?
Geez, Peter, I'm not sure how to answer that, but it's a bit of history repeating itself. If I look back to how Canada tackled acid rain, we did a pretty good job in many places, but we forgot about everything else in the environment. So I think for reasons that I don't understand, there seems to be this tendency to latch on to a particular item or a particular aspect of the environment. I agree with you that these are polycentric issues. Climate is not unrelated to what's happening to other Earth system processes. I don't have an answer for you. I'm sorry. Maybe there's others in the group here that can find a way to try to address this. Is it, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but is that what we do at the local level? Because people can't, that sort of silo siloing of activities is something that doesn't necessarily work particularly. People, um, they're not so concerned what the cause is. They know what the effect is in terms of their day-to-day life. But I think you've spoken to, I think, very clearly identified a real concern.
Well, in fact, I've talked to this group, CACOR, before on the poly crises of the environment and of geopolitics, and they're interrelated. And we've talked a little bit about that in regard to climate change in the United and its approach in the United States. So, thank you for your contributions today.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to Richard Vanderjagt, who has a
Yes.
second question. I'm pronouncing your name probably a little badly, Richard. And on deck will be Paul Beckwith.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michael, for your talk. It seemed to me you gave a lot of airtime to really, well, for instance, carbon capture, which I think you must know. It's inefficient. It's a fairy tale. Last year, Jeff Strong and I, we published an article that you had to have over 4,000 of these units before you had even put a dent into climate change. And even then, the technology itself is a fairy tale. It doesn't work. And all of these things that you're proposing, that the carbon tax, emission caps, carbon capture, all it does is help the fossil fuel industry to carry on business as usual, when really what the government ought to be doing is transitioning to renewable energy. And why wouldn't the government be investing in that rather than in inefficient, unproven technologies like carbon capture?
Yeah. Apologies if there was too much time, too much ink spilled on carbon capture. I think it does have a place. I don't think it is without merit. I get very concerned with this particular government, perhaps pushing too much time and effort into carbon capture. And I mean, I agree with you. It is about, in some ways, maintaining the status quo. And my sense is, this is an area where we need transformation, not incremental change. I thought it was important today, and I'm not trying to defend what I said, but I thought it was important today, given how much is said in Canada about carbon capture and the amount of money that's going into it, that we not just sweep it under the rug. Personally, I think from what I can understand, and I'm finding it very difficult to get a big picture sense of what the current administration is doing in terms of climate change. My sense is that they're drifting too far into the area of carbon capture.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Um, I said I'm not part of those meetings, so I don't know. But what I see coming out to the public, it seems that we're putting, as a country, we're putting a disproportional amount of effort and resources into carbon capture relative to what it could do.
Well, I think there's an article written by another one of our board members, Meg Sears, in the National Observer on carbon capture as well, which I think is probably worth a read for you.
Mhm.
But I'm sure you're well aware of the sort of the concerns about it. But really, I don't think we should be wasting our breath at all on carbon capture. It should all be on pushing towards renewables and getting it there as fast as possible.
I mean, I would agree with you that mitigation through moving towards renewables as fast as we can is, I would say, would be at the top of our list. But at the same time, I don't think we could ignore that we are going to have to adapt. We are committed for a long time. And broadening the discussion, I think there are some places for geoengineering more broadly that are going to have to be part of our arsenal of activities.
Mhm.
And in some cases, it might be just to get more buy-in. But I do get concerned if they, in fact, if these sorts of areas become, if you will, the way forward. So they're a part, and I would say certainly, not a major plank, but let's not forget about them.
Okay, everybody, let's see if we can get some of the commentators in as well as the next question, which is from Paul Beckwith, and then we'll look at Jeff Strong, who made a comment. We'll see if we can get the other 4 or 5 people that have made comments in as well, if we can be somewhat brief. But right now, Paul and Jeff is on deck.
Thank you. Anyway, great talk. I don't want to be overly critical. Wonderful talk. I love all the groups, but it is dropping out of the news, whether it be that, they declare a climate emergency in 2021. You can't maintain an emergency in the human psyche for that long, right? Once there's an emergency and you're still here, it fades. It gets weaker and weaker. So that framing, yeah, there's something wrong with that framing. I mean, I think what China's doing is phenomenal. If all countries imitated China in terms of clean energy and renewable stuff, it's wonderful. Now, on the idea of hope, I just picked up 2 books yesterday. One of them is by Timothy Lenton, and it's called Positive Tipping Point. So, he's a tipping point guy, and the book is called Positive Tipping Points, just published, came out a couple of weeks ago. And Hannah Ritchie, you mentioned, she's got a new book called Clearing the Air, and it's all about techniques to bring us from the brink. And that's another book I'd highly recommend. But anyway, it was a great talk.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, everybody, and I'd like to get Jeff Strong is going to be speaking now, and then we'll bring in Claude Butner from our cherished state of Minnesota. And then there's 3 other people who have put comments in. Try and get them all in if we can. So Jeff now and Claude on deck, please.
Jeff is out. He had to leave. He had to go for surgery.
All right. Claude, are you there? And we'll bring Charlie Hall. He wants to talk about Mauna Loa. Maybe his question is answered. But
I'm here, but I'd like to defer to the person who got me to comment, and that was Peter Vanderjagt on climate justice. I think that's a separate question. And Peter, do you want to come back on?
Okay.
Or, I'm sorry, Richard Vanderjagt, do you want to come back
on? Sure.
And then Charles Hall. Richard, you've got the floor.
Well, I just mentioned because I get emails frequently from the Climate Action Network, because since I got CACOR to join the Climate Action Network, and climate justice is a huge topic of the 186 member organizations. And in fact, we just had an international webinar yesterday, and it was brought up, and it is being discussed at various levels, and there are papers being put out. But again, the whole idea is how to bring it about and what's the best way to do this. But it is certainly a big topic.
I agree. I mean, I think I can't remember who it was now. I mean, it was Paul mentioned something about the climate emergency that was declared in 2021, which wasn't necessarily just about climate, but you cannot maintain that. But I think the whole area of climate justice helps us reframe the issue in a way that I think could have more traction. Like I said, I would think a whole session on climate justice would be warranted amongst this group as opposed to one slide.
Okay, we'll have Charlie Hall next and Anita Thorhag following on deck. Charlie?
What was it you said I was going to talk about?
Well, you made a comment about Mauna Loa. I'm not sure if it's been answered.
It's still increasing. In fact, it's increasing at a slightly greater rate over time, implying we are still growing exponentially. I hope everybody knows that the main greenhouse gas is water vapor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't deny the importance of CO2, but I don't think we know what the hell's going on with water vapor very well. The best way, if anybody wants to deal with anything personally relative to this, is not to breed. And this is never mentioned. And the next thing is to never ask for a raise, which I think gets at what generates pollutions of all sorts. And finally, I am one of the few who is more concerned about depletion than climate change. And I've talked about this a few times on CACOR. So, but there's a complexity of issues, of course. And I just argue for better science because I don't think we understand these things, including human responses, very well. But more power to you, Michael. I've got no argument with what you say.
Thanks, Charlie. Don't breathe. I'm not sure that's going to go to the top of my agenda anytime soon, but I understand what you're saying. Look, I think the point you make about overconsumption, you're right. If we would decide to consume less in any number of ways, that would go a long way. We have many examples of that, everything from our diet to other behaviors. I don't deny that we need better science. At the same time, I guess my concern about putting too much hope in that area is I'm not sure more science is going to get us a change in society in addressing this.
I agree.
And so, it's how do we mobilize that science? I think is in the communication side is critically important. And declaring climate emergencies, declaring climate crises every day, it becomes
Chicken Little.
Sorry?
Chicken Little.
Yeah, it is a bit of that. And so I think we need to think about different ways to get people on board. And again, I don't think it's not about do we use this approach to communications or do we attack the question at this level? It's about what's the suite of things. I'm not trying to add complexity, but it's I think an important point that how do we mobilize science, I think is something we need to do more about. A number of local groups that I see, I think they do great jobs of increasing awareness. I'm not sure they're leading to action. And again, it's how can we lead to action, I think is part of our current state. Thank you.
Yeah, I see Anitra is on, her video has been turned on, and then usually, not always, but usually the thank you comes from Jean Doherty, and she has also made a comment. So let's do those last two, and we should be more or less on time, Mike. So Anitra?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. I thought that this was very well laid out and that there were many points of great importance that we should consider. I wanted to go into the little corner between how you separated out three things I think are very important: industry, government versus citizens' response, and what role they each have in the carbon capture. I belong to a group at Yale University called the Center for Carbon Capture, Natural Carbon Capture. And there, of course, the physical, which you talked about beautifully, but you didn't talk about the biological. And
Yep.
At the same time that we have completely decimated our forests of the world and our coastal areas, which were the lungs that were capturing the carbon and putting it back into the earth or the sediment. We expected them to work ahead, but they're like 70% gone in some cases, most cases around the world, according to the United Nations FAO. So the question is this justice of allowing the third world people to work in their own forests, their own wetlands, their own under the water coral reefs, and sequester a great deal of the carbon that is somehow between the atmosphere and the oceans dissolved, is a way of the industries, as well as the governments, such as Canada, the United States, as well as private citizens, bringing the thing back to action, which I agree with you completely. We have a lot of solutions, but they aren't being activated properly. So I would say that one of the big questions is how can we convince governments like Canada, Germany, Great Britain, France, Scandinavia, United States, Mexico, to be much more active in the carbon capture, particularly the biological carbon capture. But perhaps this is something that you don't feel as strongly about it as the physical carbon capture.
Thanks, Anitra. Thanks for the reminder that I didn't touch on natural carbon capture. I mean, the most efficient carbon capture system we have out there isn't the one being planned by Pathway Alliance. It's the one you alluded to. Um, I'm not sure why I didn't include it in here. It probably should have been. It's uh, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of international development agendas, natural carbon capture, I think, has been receiving some attention, perhaps not enough. But it's, I think it's there. Um, it, how do we get industry involved? Especially in something like natural carbon capture? I'm not quite sure how we do that. And maybe this is where, a role of the public sector, and also I think of at a smaller scale, some private arrangements in terms of reforestation that have been quite effective. I think in some ways we'd probably, natural carbon capture doesn't do anything to address greenhouse gas emissions from the tar sands, but it plays a critical role. And I'd even look at it in the agricultural sector where restoring carbon in soils is something that is, very doable and can be supported. So thank you for reminding us about the importance of natural carbon capture.
So, Gene, do we have time for Rick Monroe? Apparently, I've missed his hand. He has wanted to make a quick comment, and then we should wrap it up. Rick, are you there?
Yes, Rick can go ahead.
Yeah, after Rick, you're on. Is Rick still there?
Yeah, yes, I am. Yeah, and I'll be quick here.
My apologies, Rick.
Yeah, no problem. I'm a patient person. Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Mike. A specific question, and then I'll provide about 1 minute of background while you think about it. Do you know who within the government of Canada is responsible for reading major multidisciplinary reports like the GEO7 that came out, Global Environmental Outlook, the various papers from the World Economic Forum, Potsdam Institute, and so on? I've inquired at a number of, I've tried everywhere within the government. I can't get an answer out of anybody, including, for instance, that GEO is 1,400 pages long. It names 4 Canadians. I wrote to each of the 4 asking, do you folks know who reads, who is mandated, responsible to read reports like this? They put 3 years of work into the bloody thing, and they don't know. So my question is, do you know?
I will answer it, I guess, in a couple of ways, or try to answer it in a couple of ways. First, part of it is being professor emeritus means I'm just not involved in day-to-day things like that. So my connections within any level of government have been greatly diminished in the last 4 or 5 years. But having said that, let me go back to a brief time when I was a civil servant. And this is when the first IPCC report was coming out. I didn't have anything to do with it. And I was a scientist at Agriculture Canada at the time. And I got pulled to one side into the ADM's office, and I had to prepare a briefing, as part of a team of about 8 people, had to prepare a briefing book for him. And he was going up in front of some Senate or Commons committee. I can't remember what it was. And it was to do with climate change in agriculture. And we ended up writing the first white paper on climate change in agriculture. And what was, I think, very instructive for me was that our job was to take that geo report of how many pages or an IPCC report and reduce it to the top 50 questions that the ADM might get in front of in front of one of these committees. So I don't know what that process is today. What I did learn at that time, and I would say working with senior managers at Carleton University, getting them to read something like that is next to impossible. So you need this translation team, this communications team, and I don't know how I mean, those are constructed from within, and I don't know how that's done today. But that's where I think the key is how do you get it on their agenda? And I guess the other part, I think I've learned in this process is not just getting it on their agenda, but getting them to think that it should be on their agenda. It's their idea, is critical to having it taken forward. So, sir, I can't answer your question. I'm not inside. I don't have those connections inside the federal government anymore.
Okay, yeah, I mean, and I've even wondered whether it's a stupid question. It's I don't see why it wouldn't be. I mean, you and Charlie were talking about the science and need for more science, or we have enough science. Well, what we've got is pretty bloody good, but if nobody reads it and analyzes it, I mean, there ought to be a team there. And for instance, we have the two foresight agencies, Policy Horizons Canada Civilian and National Defense, and I've inquired of both of them, and neither one. It doesn't show up in these documents don't show up in their list of references. It's as if they have no clue. And yet, so my point is, I guess to sum up, it's no wonder we're making so little progress on so-called sustainable development. That's all. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember, I won't obviously mention any names other than to say that it was a former this person represented Bob and I as our federal MP, and was also Minister of Environment at one point. And folks I knew in his office basically said he prided himself of not reading science documents.
Right.
So I don't, I think at the same time, though, I think, we have had some ministers of environment that have been particularly good at that over the years of taking science on board. It varies. Maybe that's just one of the hazards of democracy. I'm not just trying to slough the question off. I don't know how to get, somehow I think we have to, even something like the policymaker summary from IPCC is still a pretty dense document to read.
That's right.
And, the lessons that I learned in terms of trying to, putting a briefing book together for an ADM is not the same as providing policy advice. I'm not suggesting that's the same. But boy, it certainly was instructive of how do you take something like one of the GEO reports or an IPCC report and distill that into the top 20 or 30 or 50 topics. And I don't think we can expect the GEO teams or the IPCC teams to do that. Those are things that have to occur in-house. This is my sense. Sorry for a less than complete answer.
No, it's okay.
Jean, I think you're on.
I would like to defer to Ted Manning if he is available. I'm no longer on the board of directors, and Ted is the past president. So if Ted is available to give the thank you, that would be a little more appropriate. Ted?
Yeah, I'm actually here, and I'm sitting and listening to all of it, and I'm very intrigued. Okay, I'm very happy to talk to Mike again, hear his wonderful presentation. I don't think you really missed anything except one or two minor things other people have mentioned. I'll come back for 1 second to answer that last question because I was in the Environment Canada policy shop for quite some time. During times when they did fairly well with people like Vic Buxton and those trying to actually get knowledge through on acid rain through to later where they were trying to do sustainable development
And my role, along with 3 others, was to get there at 6 in the morning to make sure we had 2 hours to prepare a briefing note on something that came in, on whatever it was, give it to the minister or give it to the 2IC for the minister who would read it. It could never be more than 150 words. It could never be more than a single page. And it had to be done within 3 hours because they would make a policy decision on it. That was why I left government some years ago to start my own company. So yes, I'm very upset in some ways of how little real information, knowledge, research, studies, anything gets through. It's down to about 10 pages or 10 sentences. And often decisions are made by nobody there in the room who's ever heard of the subject. It's the one page. If it's not exactly right on the page, it's not going to happen. I believe that is still happening. Anyway, that said, Michael, thank you very much for raising this. I know that many of us have tried to make people understand science, apply it at various points to real issues, and to use nowadays to try and mobilize people to truth in one way or another. Really a challenge. So I would thank you again for coming and keeping everybody around listening and asking questions. This is a very good topic, and please come again.